of aid. Maybe that's kind of I put a question mark there because I don't think it's written in stone that it's the end of aid, but there certainly have been some major changes just in the last 2 months, right? And the subtitle is How Current Issues with the Financing, the Funding of International Development Invite an Opportunity to Question Some of the Fundamental Aspects of the Development Paradigm. I think I've shared with many of you all that I worked directly with different nonprofit organizations in the development sector for about 10 or 12 years. And for the past 8 years, I've worked as a consultant with several different organizations. And one of the reasons I wanted to talk about this last week and this week is because I was on a call, a consulting call about 3 weeks ago now, with several organizations, large scale organizations that work in Asia and Africa, around the area of regenerative agriculture, what's an idea known as evergreening, which is about working with small farmers to try and obviously improve livelihoods, improve incomes, improve food security and sovereignty, while also regreening the planet. And it was kind of fascinating to see just 3 weeks ago how much funding had been cut for all of these organizations working in dozens of countries in Africa, dozens of countries in Asia, and in here in Central America and in Latin America where I live, the same thing is occurring, right? So we're going to start by taking a quick statistical look at the current reduction in global aid. The numbers are out there. We know exactly what's happening. Different diplomats and politicians in the United States and in Europe have stated very clearly what they're trying to do. Um, at the same time, it's not just cutting financing, right? It's not just a reduction in how much money is flowing into countries, but there is also emerging this kind of global consensus that aid, the idea of development itself is the idea behind it, the paradigm behind it is shifting. So I want to take a look at some of the suppositions or the postulations of what this new development paradigm entail. And I'm going to question whether it is in fact a new paradigm of development or if it's just kind of a continuation of the past. And then, yeah, the idea is, okay, we can sit here and lament everything that's happening and say, oh, we're losing our jobs. People who that seems to me to be right now one of the kind of main critiques is that thousands of people who are development professionals who have dedicated their entire lives to working in the development sector, all of a sudden are finding themselves out of work, out of employment. So I guess the question we have before us is, do we simply lament that and try to return to the status quo where aid money was flowing, or can we take this moment in time, this current kind of trajectory, and use it as an opportunity to fundamentally rethink the suppositions behind what aid entails, right? And so I'm going to talk about two different directions. One is simply give in to this idea as aid for profit or aid for strategic interest paradigm, which seems to be emerging directly from the mouths of people in different administrations in Europe and North America, or talk about different ways to do aid. So let's go ahead and start with some statistics. I think probably most people have read some of the news that in the United States, Elon Musk, the world's wealthiest man for the time being, is has been given a fairly important post in the government, trying to reduce inefficiency, essentially trying to cut out a lot of what he considers and what the current administration considers to be excessive spending by the government. And one of the first things that came under attack by this new government administration called DOGE, was USAID. So the Trump administration, about almost ago now, said that it is eliminating more than 90% of the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID's foreign aid contracts and $60 billion in overall U.S. assistance around the world, putting numbers on its plans to eliminate the majority of U.S. development and humanitarian help abroad. 90% reduction, right? And it's not just in USAID. A lot of people, who work in the development organization in development organizations in Africa and Asia and Latin America, probably have some sort of USAID funding. USAID funds not just, direct development projects, but they also fund the US or the UN, lots of UN programs like the World Food Program, The U.S. pulled out of the World Health Organization, where there was lots of financing for health initiatives. In all, the Trump administration said it will eliminate 5,800 of 6,200 multi-year U.S. aid contract awards. Okay, so he's leaving 400, and many of those are military type of projects, especially in Israel. There's actually an increase in military funding going to the state of Israel, while 90% of the U.S. aid and only 400 of over 6,000 UAID contracts are going to continue. Another 4,100 of 9,100 State Department grants were also being eliminated. So again, it's not just the financing that goes through the channel of USAID, but also lots of development projects that go through the State Department, other development projects that went through direct financing to different UN programs, such as the World Food Program, lots of organizations that did health initiatives through the WHO, the World Health Organization, etc. Um, what happened? So what do we know? In 2 months, it was fairly a lightning response. Shortly after coming to office, one of the first things President Trump did was put an executive order that essentially froze aid for a month-long period. And then a month later, confirmed that 90% of the funding was going to be cut off. And so right now you see lots of different analysis and studies and reports showing, well, what does that entail? Who is being affected, right? And here are just a few things I pulled from the internet from different watchdogs, think tanks, development organizations that are saying this is what is occurring just in the last 2 months. One, about 3.8 million women around the world are losing access to contraception, right? 9 billion people only in Afghanistan, about a quarter of the population will no longer receive US funded healthcare services. 700,000 people in Burkina Faso and Mali have lost access to water, food, or health services. The World Food Program, the US was the world's largest donor to this program, has shut down its operations in South Africa, where 27 million people are at risk of hunger as the country faces extreme droughts. In Nigeria, 25,000 extremely malnourished children will no longer be receiving food assistance by April. Another major thing that you're seeing is that the United States was one of the leading funders for people living with HIV and AIDS. So a lot of medications, a lot of preventative access. And before the aid cuts, the U.S. was funding about 70% of the global HIV and AIDS response. If you can see here in this graph, women receiving HIV treatment, 66% of that funding came from the U.S. HIV patients receiving therapies, about 58%, and overall about 70%. So essentially overnight, the millions and millions of people who live in countries where HIV and AIDS is a very serious issue, are finding themselves without access to medications because that funding has been cut. One of the things that I think is important to understand is that lots of graphs like this show that the United States is one of the main funders of several different development initiatives, aid initiatives. So, for example, with HIV and AIDS, the United States was the main funder for the the World Food Program, giving food to drought-stricken countries, to areas where famines, areas hit by major natural disasters. But one thing that is important to understand is that the United States government only offers between 0.2 and 0.8% of its GDP goes to international development and humanitarian assistance. This is from the U.S. State Department. This shows what percentage of their budget goes to directly to foreign aid. And several people, researchers, have shown that this statistic of 0.8% is actually inflated because much of that money is military type of aid. And so many people who work in the development areas say that if you're funding, purchase of arms and military equipment, that's not necessarily that can't be translated as international assistance, as an international aid. So some people say that the real percentage of the U.S. budget is between 0.2 and 0.4%. However, because of the enormous size of the U.S. economy, billions and billions and trillions of dollars, the United States donations are the leading, even though it's a reduced amount in terms of total GDP. Um, it is the largest financer by different countries. So the United States donations to the UN accounted 40% of all humanitarian aid, both for peacekeeping efforts. Almost half of the food aid through the World Food Program used to come from the United States. And yeah, in the last 2 months, all of that is essentially disappearing. So obviously, if you're running a company, right, and you're, 90% of your operating budget gets slashed, from one day to the next, from one month to the next, this causes major upheavals. And right now, what we're seeing, people who work around the world in aid are saying, what's happening? How are we going to respond to this? All of a sudden, this financing we've had for years and years is ending. I think it's also important to mention that this isn't a unilateral decision by the United States. Obviously, my take on it is that Donald Trump, as a president, is a very mediatic figure. He's a media magnet. That's kind of where he came from, right? The person who had his own reality TV show, who's created a brand for himself, and is about capturing attention. And I think that much of the attention has been focused on the loss of 90% of the budget of USAID and billions of dollars of financing for all of these different programs around the world. But this has been kind of a tendency around the world, and I think Donald Trump kind of in the United States government provided an impetus for the rest of the world to kind of follow suit. I was like I mentioned 3 weeks ago, I was on a call with about 15 different organizations, and mostly in Africa, but also in Asia, working in regenerative development. And these are the words from one of the people who was a leader in the regreening movement in Africa, and he said the sheer horror of what's going on is scarcely graspable. In Kenya alone, estimates are that 56,000 people have lost their jobs, people who worked directly in the development organizations. And the U.S. aid cuts are merely the most visible. I think that's important. Again, it's visible because of the media attention focused on the personality of the U.S. president. But the Dutch, for example, are trying to cut ODA, which is their kind of it's the Dutch US aid, I guess you could say. The Belgians are planning a 25%. The British are planning a 40% cut. The French are planning cuts of more than a third of their development assistance. The new German government is planning to cut. Even Sweden, which has long been kind of held as this example of nations who dedicate. If you can see in this graph over here, this is the official development assistance by each country as a percent of their gross national index. How much money they have. In Sweden, has always been slightly right, hovering around 1% or sometimes over 1%, which has kind of been always the goal of many development organizations around the world. Has said the developed world needs to dedicate at the very least 1% of their GDP to development assistance around the world. And the only country that really ever kind of lived up to that was Sweden and Luxembourg. And even Sweden, which has kind of been a leader in this area, has drastically cut back their foreign assistance. Here in El Salvador, the country where I work, and the Swedish cooperation agency recently shut down. They left the country. And they're only working they used to work in every Central American country, and today they're only in Guatemala. So this is kind of a trend that you see, right? Governments across Europe are also cutting back. This is Netherlands are slashing 30% of its aid budget. And one of the things this is from an article in the Economist. And the Netherlands government said that they are going to redirect funds to projects that directly contribute to Dutch interests. And I think that's interesting. Let's see why. When as a young, kind of idealistic young man, when I was in my early 20s, I had kind of, I studied history as an undergraduate, and I looked at all of the violent, horrible history of colonialism, right, of exploitation. And I was attracted to the idea of aid because I saw it as a retribution, right? As a movement towards justice, right? Just here's some quick examples. These are two on the left, on the right here, are were two for the longest time people who were kind of idealistic and hopeful about what U.S. Or what foreign assistance, what development could be about. There were kind of two prime justifications for that. One was kind of this historical retribution, this movement towards historical justice, right? I remember when I was younger and reading about the civil rights movement in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr., said that the arc of history is long, but it always bends towards justice. And it was kind of this idea that, as you study history, you see all of this, the colonial violence, the genocides, the exploitation. And I hoped as a young person that the idea of development could be about trying to make amends for past wrongs, right? So only from 1492 to 1560 in the Americas, in the New World, over 100 tons of gold were extracted from the Americas and sent back to Europe, with over 25,000 tons of silver had been transported back to Spain. The sheer amount of exploitation of natural resources. This is just talking about gold and silver. We could talk about lumber. We could talk about natural resources such as guano, which essentially kept, which is bird poop that they found on these islands, which kept European agriculture going for centuries and centuries. And then in more recent times, the exploitation of oil, of other fossil fuels, of minerals needed for the development. Was massive, right? It was massive. And these weren't things that were bought from the New World or from Africa or from Asia. These were things that were stolen, right? Openly, and without any sort of hiding, right? So from some vantage points, the wealth of Europe and the West was built from the theft of the natural wealth, and I guess you could also say the social wealth of the New World. Obviously, there were millions and millions and millions of African people who were stolen from their countries, enslaved, shipped across the world. How do you put a price tag on that suffering, right? On that amount of violence and that amount of genocidal violence, right? And so for some people who work in aid, the idea was that aid could be construed as a form of delayed reimbursement or compensation for centuries of colonial exploit, right? Sending less than 1% of your GDP is never going to make up, for centuries of exploitation and violence. But for me as a young man, I saw this as an opportunity, at the very least, to try to respond to the dark side of history, right? Another kind of historical kind of reason for aid was more related to the issue of climate, right? So the United States, for example, since 1850, has released over 509 gigatons of carbon dioxide, right, through its development, through burning coal, through extracting resources, through burning oil, and is responsible for the largest share of historical emissions, with about between 20 and 25% of all of the carbon dioxide that is in our atmosphere right now has come from the United States. If you add Europe, it adds another about 19 to 22%. So just Europe and just the United States, historically are responsible for almost half of the carbon dioxide in the air. From this vantage point, the developed world has used an enormous share of the carbon budget to create its wealth, right? It's the wealth of the developed world has come from extracting fossil fuels, extracting resources, building economies through this route, right? However, it's very clear that now as climate change begins to become ever more evident, the most severe climate emergencies will be experienced by nations and peoples who have contributed only a fraction of the historical carbon emissions to the atmosphere. Aid, from this lens, is a process of sharing that historical energy glut with nations which cannot replicate this path, right? We can't pretend that nations like in sub-Saharan Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, are going to be able to have their fair share of energy resources to follow the same development path as the United States and Europe, simply because one, those resources are no longer there, right? If you extract coal, if you extract oil, if you extract natural gas, there's a limit to how much is there. And though there's, huge amounts, it's harder and harder to get, right? So all of these easy to access resources, which funded, in was kind of the motor that propelled the developed world towards its development, are gone. And secondly, even if those, energy resources and natural resources were there, if every country tried to follow, the pathway of development of Europe or North America, the climate emergency would explode, right? We would have to mine every square inch of the world, and so there's kind of a tacit assumption by the world that the undeveloped world or the developing world or whatever you want to call it simply cannot follow the same path of development just because there are not resources there. And if we were to try and replicate that, it would be a complete disaster, right? So for many people, aid was this idea of sharing this historical kind of energy theft, right, with the rest of the world. Today, however, those historical justifications, the reason that many people got into, were attracted to this whole idea of justice through aid, justice through development, are being sacrificed on the altar of pragmatism, hard politics, and geopolitical realities, right? When the Netherlands, the Dutch government says directly that we're only going to fund projects that directly contribute to Dutch interests, that is an example of what every country around the world is thinking. As foreign aid budgets shrink, every dollar must prove its value, right? Only programs that align with donor priorities will survive. The reality is that many governments no longer see aid as a moral obligation, right? That those kind of fundamental, nascent principles about why development, why aid was necessary, are gone. I'm going to argue here in a second that I don't think that those were really ever true. I think they were kind of lip service to what has always been, right? This idea of aid as a foreign policy tool, right? But now, even the shroud or the pretension that we are going to use aid in order to make up for past historical wrongs is gone. People no longer say that, right? The reality is that many governments no longer see aid as a moral obligation. They now expect direct returns, whether in trade deals, security benefits, or economic gains. Last week, we talked about how the Trump administration laid this very, very clear in response to the military aid that they were giving to Ukraine in the war against Russia. Donald Trump said basically, we will continue to offer you military aid in exchange for unfettered access to your rare earth minerals, right? So rare earth minerals are one of the most strategic geopolitical assets. The United States does not have any. So they're saying, we will offer you aid money if you open up your country to us. This is neocolonialism. This is kind of the same principles that happened in 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, 1900s, but now applied to the world today. In the United States, here's a picture of Keir Starmer, who's the Prime Minister of the UK, and he said just a couple weeks ago, we will fund increase in defense spending by cutting spending on overseas development. So right now, countries in Europe who are afraid of the Russian threat, who feel abandoned, by NATO, by the United States pulling out of some of its, military agreements with Europe, and many countries in Europe are saying we're going to stop funding health programs, development programs, food programs, and we're going to start spending more on our own military. In the United States, Marco Rubio, the head of the Department of State, laid clear he had a huge review of U.S. aid programs, and he said we're going to focus all of our remaining. They cut 90%, but the remaining 10% is going to be focused on programs and projects that can respond to three main questions. One, does this project make America stronger? Does it make America safer? Does it make America more prosperous? Right? The brutal reality, from my perspective, has been laid clear by recent developments, right? The fact that people are now saying this, right? The Dutch government is saying we're only going to fund things that are in our interests, that align with donor priorities, that make the donor country stronger, safer, and more prosperous. The difference, I think, today is that now donor countries are saying this openly, right? We say in Spanish, without any fuzz on the tongue, right? Without trying to hide behind any pretense of moral obligations or trying to right historic wrongs, right? Aid, I believe, has always reflected a colonialist attitude wherein donor countries are not repaying their debt for years of colonial exploitation, climate change chaos created by their economic growth historically, but rather aid has always been a seeking to further their interests around the world. Now, that doesn't mean that people who work in aid projects, are not motivated by good and noble ideas. I got into aid into the world of community development because I really did believe that there was this moral obligation of the wealthy countries to reimburse, to try and right historical wrongs. And that's not to say that there hasn't been, very good and necessary programs throughout the last 50, 60, 70 years of aid, that have made a major difference. I'd like to think that some of the projects that I've partaked in have been important in uh, helping small farmers, helping women, and things like that. However, the fundamental apparatus of financing aid has always been tied, I think, to foreign interests of the donor countries, right? If aid was truly reimbursement for past injustices, for colonial violence, for trying to, make up for some of the climate change chaos that's forthcoming, then why would we create this enormous hierarchical apparatus that determines how aid dollars are to be spent, right? If it was really about giving back what was stolen, we wouldn't have, these multi-level funnels, where grassroots organizations have to suck up to a national organization. The national organization has to learn how to ask for the right type of money from the international donor, et cetera, et cetera. Furthermore, many who work in the aid industry believe strongly that aid as a tool for development is not really working. In this week's or about 2 weeks ago in The Economist, there was a great article that said, in 60 years of independence, Malawians, people from Malawi, have had more spent on them by aid agencies than by their own government. The country has many more officials managing aid contracts than overseeing foreign trade, right? And around the world, I think we've seen this. Aid, development, financing of social projects has created an enormous dependence, right? An enormous dependency where in many cases, national governments kind of are able to slip past their obligations, right? The idea of welfare, of investing in small farmers, investing in national infrastructure, whatever it might be, because there is always this assumption that, well, the foreign aid companies, the foreign aid donors are going to do that for us, right? And so in many cases, the money that flows through the development funnel throughout the years has been utilized as a tool to continue, uh, I would say, hierarchical kind of power relations between the developed world and the undeveloped world. And partly that has occurred, I think, through creating dependencies, right? That, the countries are going to have to continue to depend on us. Today, again, I think we just see this being said openly, right? You have people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump who, again, have no fuzz on their tongue, right? Say openly kind of what has always been the tacit assumption of donor countries about what aid is for, right? The bottom line of our work has always been this. This was again from the conversation I had 3 weeks ago that got me thinking about this, and this was from a major organization in Africa that again works in regreening. He said the bottom line of our work has always been this: land restoration brings three returns: economic, environmental, and social. Most of us, people who work in the development organizations, are in this area of business and this line of work because the latter two, environmental and social concerns, speak to us. In the changing world, right, in the changing nature of how development and aid is going to be in the future, we will need to be much more rigorous and disciplined about demonstrating the former, economic. It's all about the dollars now, right? Programs must demonstrate mutual benefits for donor and recipient countries if they want to maintain funding. This will involve embracing a degree of pragmatic idealism. If we want to continue to receive aid dollars, when we talk about what are the indicators of change in a project, well, we can no longer talk about how many children are not starving tonight. We can no longer talk about, how many women are receiving needed health care, right? How many people living with HIV and AIDS are receiving life-saving medications? That is no longer important to the donor countries. And this isn't a moral uh, kind of accusation. This is exactly what they're saying, right? Now, what you have to show is that if you fund, let's say, a world food program type of intervention in a sub-Saharan African country, the indicator of change is not about how many children are no longer malnourished, how many children are no longer dying. Rather, it's about how this aid might help to stop the flow of illegal migration to Europe. Right? For example, that's what they want to hear. That's how you're going to have to frame your development projects in order to attract the interest of donor countries. Here's just one example: Gavi, which is a major international program focusing on the Vaccine Alliance, right? So it's about investing to make all sorts of different vaccines, from measles types of dysentery, available to the developing world, right? So beyond saving lives, right? So the United States donates millions of dollars to this program, as does the European Union. And in the past, organizations would say, well, when you donate this, we can show that, millions of children are no longer, going to die from measles or mumps or polio or whatever it might be. Today, who cares? That's not about that. Saving lives is not the justification for aid. Rather, you have to say, well, they create healthier markets, right? That buy goods from donor nations. If you don't have millions of children in Africa dying from polio, or millions of children in Latin America dying from starvation, well, they are consumers for your products, right? You're going to increase the amount, and at the same time, if you send, donor money to El Salvador, shall we say, well, the El Salvadoran government is going to open up through free trade agreements, and we're going to have a healthier population that's going to buy more of your stuff, right? Fully funding Gavi over the next 5 years through foreign aid commitments could inject 100 billion into developing economies, right? That's, who cares if that's good for the actual people. The real importance is that, well, this expands the customer bases for American and European businesses, right? Plus, healthier populations abroad reduce the risk of pandemics, right? So if you help vaccinate young people against polio and measles and other things like that, really, we don't want you to care about the people whose lives are being saved, but care about your own people, and then maybe there's less of a threat of polio infiltrating the United States or Europe, right? That sounds very, I would say, sarcastic, maybe, to say it lightly, but again, this is exactly what the donor countries are saying, right? Essentially, if aid organizations want to continue to exist, they will need to forget most of what they know regarding project design, indicators of measurement, logical frameworks, everything that we've learned, those of us who have, about how to frame projects, right? How to try and, gather the funding we need, play the game, etc. Today, donor agents will require hard information showing how any aid project will directly benefit the strategic foreign interests of the donor countries. This, again, I think, is the death of aid as a moral reparation or atonement for historical injustices and present day inequities, if that ever truly did exist. And I think that we can discuss that, whether there ever really was this truly kind of moral obligation, or if it was always. But today, the fuzz is off the tongue. People are saying exactly what I think has always been implicit in the aid industry. And here's the question. All right. So for many people, obviously, I wanted to show at the very beginning that there are very real consequences. I think it's probably safe to say that in the past 2 months, maybe hundreds of thousands of people have died because they no longer have access to medications, to healthcare, to food in famine-struck areas. This is a very real, serious issue. However, how do we respond to that, right? In most of the articles, especially when Elon Musk and Donald Trump announced the 90% cuts, there was an enormous uproar of, oh, this is horrible, thousands of people losing their jobs, et cetera, et cetera. But there is one. This is a journalist that writes in the Guardian. He's from the Caribbean, and I think he was one of the few people who said this is an opportunity. And here are a few. He wrote several articles over the span of a week or two. Uh, and he said that, look, in my USAID funded health, education, infrastructure, disaster relief in the Caribbean, right? In the different Caribbean countries. However, many argue that the programs were more about maintaining economic and geopolitical dominance for a nation that has more than 750 military bases in at least 80 countries, right? The Jamaican Prime Minister, this article said, acknowledged that the loss of USAID funding presented immediate cash flow challenges, but said that his country's long-term vision was one of reducing reliance on aid while strengthening its economic foundation and independence, right? From a national perspective, I think countries like Malawi, countries in Africa, countries in Latin America, countries in Asia need to see this as, look, this is a wake-up call, right? We need to try to reduce this dependency, right? This paternalism where enormous parts of our GDP, of our operating budget come from aid. And because of that, how we operate our country, what we invest in is not determined by democratic principles where people in our country, elect their officials to do certain things, but rather, how we invest is determined by, what the donor agency wants to give us. No, we need to see this as an opportunity to consecrate our independence, our autonomy, right? Foreign aid has for too long stifled true development in the global south while enabling corruption and inefficiency. And now we must build self sustaining economies. This sentiment is echoed by anti corruption agencies and activists who argue that aid can prop up corrupt elites more than it benefits ordinary citizens, right? That's not to say that there are going to be very, very serious problems, with this sudden and drastic loss of aid. At the same time, I think these are the questions we need to be asking, right? Otherwise, it's just, continue to beg for more handouts or say, look, this is an opportunity where we're going to have to question, some of the fundamental aspects of our industry. Let me see what time it is here. I'll try and go a little bit faster here. Give me just a second.
Yeah,
So we
we're
can,
right at about 40 minutes after the hour.
okay, I'm almost. All right. Yeah, okay, we already said that. So what do we do? I think there are two possible directions. One, we can give in to this aid for profit slash aid for strategic interest paradigm. This essentially relinquishes national sovereignty, control over strategic resources, and the ability to dictate autonomous development agendas. By formulating development projects that respond to the strategic interests of donor countries, the development paradigm is even more firmly entrenched in the westernization of the world and further colonial exploit. This is essentially continue to ask for handouts, right? The other response to this is kind of what we see in this type of article that I mentioned in the Guardian, right? Asserting the right to autonomously define one's own pathway to the good life, right? This pathway offers the opportunity to question the hidden assumptions of the development discourse paradigm, namely that poverty is an evil that must be defeated, that better incomes and more purchasing power inevitably lead to more satisfaction, that higher standards of living must be irrevocably pursued to improve the human condition, right? That the American dream is the only thing worth pursuing, right? Maybe we can expand our minds, expand a little bit our ideas, right? Um, again, in a past class, we talk about really what happens in the aid. There's what's known as the aid funnel, where 2.1% of all of the billions and billions of dollars spent on global aid goes to local organizations, either directly or indirectly, right? There's a development funnel, right? It is always, enormous amounts of aid money have been, sent to corrupt government officials, have been funneled into jobs for people who work in the development industry, right? So really, when we talk about this enormous loss of aid, I think it's important to understand that in the end, according to private research and things, only 2% of those billions of dollars, really eventually ended up in communities where it was needed, right? How can we try to rethink this so that even with the drastic reductions, we can change how aid happens, right? Um, I think another way we can reject this kind of neo-colonial aid is to value completely the economic contributions of subsistence, of self-reliance, community autonomy, even when they contradict the Western tools of indicators and measurements, right? So this idea, that a small farmer who exists outside the market economy is irrevocably going to be considered poor, right? He is money poor. He doesn't have income. He's not in, he doesn't have a salary. He doesn't, have all of the benefits that come with operating within uh, the economy. Our intervention that needs to be modernized, right? I would say that no. How can development look of valuing, the autonomy, the independence of a small farmer producing for his family, for his community, even though he operates outside all of these metrics that the Western development paradigm tries to impose. There's a figure in Greek myths was a very kind of contrarian figure. And there's one moment when he was talking with a philosopher, sucked up to Dionysus, the king, shall we say. He sucked up to the king and he won himself a spot at his court. And this Aristippus saw Diogenes cooking. Diogenes was very poor, very simple. And he saw him cooking lentils for a meal, lentils kind of representing the food of the poor, the food of the simpleton, right? And Aristippus said to Diogenes, if you would only learn to compliment the king, you wouldn't have to live on lentils. And Diogenes replied, but if you would only learn to live on lentils, you wouldn't have to flatter Dionysus, right? And I think that this dialogue, which is 3,000 years old, is exactly what development people who work in the world of development are facing today, right? We can either suck up to the king, to the courts, to the gods, right? To continue to receive, this uh, the 2.1% of donor money that goes through the funnel. We can try and reframe our projects to show how we're benefiting the interests of the United States or whatever, or we can learn to live on lentils, right? And what does that mean? What does it mean? Development as a strengthening of the vernacular, of finding your own pathway, of reinvesting in autonomy, right? So real quick, just to try and sum up, the cut in foreign aid and assistance is inevitably causing serious harms and hardships in many parts of the world, right? And many important and necessary programs. Let's not brush that over. Let's be honest about the suffering that is occurring. From a moral and ethical standpoint, wealthy countries most certainly do have a responsibility to atone for the history of colonial atrocities, the defilement of our shared planet, and the modern day inequities. Aid has claimed to fill that role, though with dubious historical efficacy. However, the reality is that foreign aid has always, one, come with strings attached, and two, been an instrument of advancing strategic interests, and three, played a major role in universalizing the idea of the American dream, right? To the detriment of the vernacular, of autonomous conceptualizations of what it means to live well in place. And lastly, the current reformatting of the aid industry offers an important opportunity for nations, communities, and organizations and individuals to reconceptualize autonomous pathways to endogenous development. That's my